I've always thought of myself as someone who's pretty grounded, not easily shaken. Life on our ranch in Willow Creek is predictable in the best way. The steady rhythm of caring for the animals, mornings filled with fresh air, evenings quiet under wide open skies. It's the kind of life I've always wanted, and honestly, it suits me. My horse, Midnight, is a big part of why I love it here. We've had him for years, and there's just something calming about the bond we've built. He's reliable, steady, never surprises me in a bad way. Jason, my husband, has always been the more adventurous one. He loves pushing limits, trying new things, coming up with ideas I'd never dream up myself. It's one of the things I admire about him, how bold he can be. But sometimes, he takes things further than I'm comfortable with. And this time, well, it really threw me. It all started on what seemed like a normal afternoon. We were done with most of the chores. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the pasture. I was brushing down Midnight, just enjoying the quiet. That's when Jason walked up, that familiar glint in his eye. The one I've learned means he's got something brewing. "Hey," he said casually, "I've been thinking we should film something with Midnight. Something fun. Something a little different." I smiled at first because he's always talking about making videos, sharing little slices of our life out here. Usually it's lighthearted stuff. Trail rides, feeding time, the dogs chasing each other around. But something about the way he said it this time gave me pause. I could feel it right away, that slight shift in the air. I asked him what he had in mind, thinking maybe it'd be another harmless idea. But the more he talked, the more I felt a tightness creeping into my chest. His plan wasn't anything dangerous, not exactly, but it was definitely out of left field. It involved setting up lights, getting Midnight to perform a few tricks we hadn't practiced in months, and capturing the whole thing in one take. Jason seemed excited, but there was an intensity to it, a sense that he'd already decided how it should go before I even had a chance to process it. I nodded along, trying to hide my hesitation, but inside, I felt uneasy. Midnight's a smart horse, but he's sensitive. He picks up on energy, and if something feels off, he reacts. That's part of why I've always been careful not to overwhelm him. Jason, on the other hand, tends to dive right in, confident things will just fall into place. And normally, I trust him. We've built a life together on trust, on knowing each other's strengths and when to lean in or pull back. But standing there listening to him lay out his vision, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't sitting right with me. I tried to voice it, just gently. "Are you sure Midnight's up for all that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Jason brushed it off with a grin, telling me not to worry, that it'd be fine. And maybe it would be. But something about how quickly he dismissed my concern made me feel smaller, like my instinct didn't matter in the moment. That's when the unease really settled in. This quiet question humming in the back of my mind. Was I just being cautious, or was there something deeper telling me to pay attention? It's not that I didn't want to support him. I've always admired his big ideas, the way he sees possibilities where I see routines. But I also know myself, and I know when something feels off. And right then, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. I didn't want to let him down, but I also didn't want to ignore my own gut. I told myself maybe I was overthinking, maybe once we got everything set up it wouldn't feel like such a big deal. But even as we started gathering equipment, even as I helped lead Midnight to the spot Jason had picked out, I couldn't shake that whisper in the back of my mind telling me to pause. It wasn't about not trusting Jason. It was about trusting myself enough to recognize when I wasn't ready to jump into something just because someone else was excited about it. By the time we had the lights in place and the camera set up, I felt like I was carrying this quiet tension inside me, unsure of how to voice it without sounding like I was doubting him or being difficult. He gave me that smile again, the one that usually makes me laugh, but this time made me feel a little trapped, like the moment was already moving too fast. I stood there next to Midnight, trying to steady my breathing, wondering how far I was willing to go just to keep the peace. It's strange how one small suggestion, one unexpected idea, can stir up so much inside. I realized then it wasn't just about the video or the horse. It was about whether I felt comfortable stepping outside of what felt safe, about whether I could trust myself to know when something wasn't sitting right. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment, I knew I had to figure out how to listen to that voice inside, even if it meant having a harder conversation later. The thing is, my connection with Midnight isn't something that happened overnight. It's not just that he's our horse or that he's part of life on the ranch. It's deeper than that. Something built slowly over years, day by day, moment by moment. I've always believed animals, especially horses, can feel things we don't even say out loud. They know when we're stressed, when we're calm, when something's weighing on us, and Midnight's no different. From the very first day we brought him home, I felt like we had this unspoken understanding. It's not easy to explain unless you've spent time around horses. The way they communicate without words, the way they respond to energy, to intention. And with Midnight, I've always been careful to respect that. When he first arrived at the ranch, he wasn't the confident, steady horse he is now. He was skittish, a little unsure of people, not completely trusting. I spent hours just sitting with him in the stable, letting him get used to my presence. No rushing, no forcing anything. Over time, he started to relax. I'd brush him gently, talk softly, and eventually he'd lean into me like he knew he was safe. That kind of trust doesn't happen by accident. You earn it little by little. That's why, standing there that afternoon with Jason laying out his big plan, I couldn't ignore the complicated feelings bubbling up inside me. It wasn't just about my hesitation. It was about how this would affect Midnight too. He's not just an animal we can treat like a prop in a video. He's part of the family. And because of how closely we're connected, I could already sense he was picking up on the tension I was feeling. Horses are intuitive like that. They mirror what's going on around them, especially with people they're close to. So when Jason kept pushing the idea, talking excitedly about how great the video would be, all I could think about was how Midnight might react. Would he stay calm if I wasn't calm? Would he sense that something felt off to me? I tried not to let it show, but I knew Midnight could probably tell anyway. That's the thing about animals. They don't need you to say anything to know how you feel. As Jason continued adjusting the camera and setting up the lights, I kept glancing over at Midnight. He stood there patiently, but his ears kept flicking back and forth, his eyes alert. I could tell he was trying to figure out what was going on, reading the energy between Jason and me. And every time I looked at him, I felt this wave of protectiveness wash over me. We've been through a lot together, Midnight and I. Long rides across the fields when I needed to clear my head, quiet mornings brushing him down while the sun came up, even tough days when nothing seemed to go right, and all I needed was the steady, grounding presence of a horse who wouldn't judge or expect anything from me. That kind of bond makes you want to shield them from anything that might cause stress or confusion. So even though Jason's idea wasn't dangerous, not technically, the fact that it felt unpredictable, rushed, made me uneasy. I knew Jason wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He just gets caught up in his big ideas sometimes, focused on the outcome, the excitement of making something new. And normally, I'd go along with it because I trust him, because I know his heart's in the right place. But this time felt different. Maybe because it involved something, or someone, I felt responsible for in a different way. Midnight relies on me to keep things steady, to make sure he's safe and comfortable. That's what makes our relationship work. It's built on consistency, on me being someone he can count on. As I stood there watching Jason set up, my mind kept circling back to that. How would Midnight feel about all this? Would he stay calm with the lights glaring, the camera rolling, and the tension humming in the air? Or would he feel unsettled because I was unsettled? I didn't want to be the reason he felt stressed or confused. That thought sat heavy in my chest, making me hesitate even more. Every time Jason glanced over, giving me an encouraging smile, I felt torn. I wanted to support him. I've always admired his adventurous spirit, the way he pushes boundaries and thinks outside the box. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the right way to do it. Not when it might affect Midnight. It felt like I was caught between two people I cared about, both expecting something from me, and I didn't know how to balance it. Midnight stood quietly, waiting, trusting me like he always did. And that trust was the thing pulling at me most. It wasn't just about whether the video would turn out well or whether I could step outside my comfort zone. It was about whether I was honoring the connection I had with him, whether I was respecting the years we'd spent building that bond. I've always believed that animals, especially ones as sensitive as horses, deserve to have their trust protected. And as much as I wanted to go along with Jason's plan, a part of me kept wondering if I'd be letting Midnight down by pushing forward when my gut told me otherwise. I kept thinking back to all the times Midnight had been there for me without question, without hesitation. All the times I'd leaned on him without worrying whether he'd be steady and calm. And now it felt like the roles were reversed. It was my turn to be the one making sure he felt safe, making sure I wasn't letting outside pressure cloud my judgment. The longer we stood there, the more complicated everything felt. It wasn't just about filming a video anymore. It was about loyalty, responsibility, and trust. I could feel it knotting up inside me, this quiet struggle between wanting to support Jason and wanting to protect Midnight. And I knew, deep down, that ignoring that feeling wouldn't make it go away. So I kept glancing between the two of them, Jason adjusting the camera, caught up in the excitement, and Midnight standing still, ears flicking, waiting on me. And all I could think about was how much that trust meant to me, how much I valued the quiet, steady connection I'd worked so hard to build. It made everything feel heavier, more complicated, like there wasn't an easy choice to make. Standing there in the middle of the barn, everything felt like it was pulling in two directions at once. Jason was still buzzing with excitement, checking the camera settings, talking about how great the video would turn out, how creative and fresh it would be. Every word out of his mouth was filled with enthusiasm, like he couldn't wait to get started. And normally, that kind of energy would have pulled me along with it. I've always admired how fearless he is when it comes to trying something new, how easily he dives into an idea without second-guessing himself. But this time, I couldn't ignore the tight knot forming in my stomach. No matter how much I wanted to share in his excitement, something inside me was holding me back. Part of me felt guilty for even hesitating. I mean, this is Jason, my partner, my best friend, the person I've trusted and leaned on for years. We've built our life together on that trust, on being a team, and usually when he comes to me with a plan, I'm right there beside him, ready to make it happen. But now, standing there with Midnight beside me, I felt caught between wanting to support him and this growing unease that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just nerves. It felt deeper, like something inside me was trying to sound an alarm, and I didn't know how to ignore it. I kept glancing at Midnight, who was standing quietly like he always does, calm and steady. But I could tell he sensed something was different. His ears kept flicking back, his eyes watching me closely, like he was waiting to see what I would do. It reminded me how in tune he is with me, how much he picks up on my mood without me saying a word. And that just made the tension inside me worse. I didn't want him to feel unsettled because of what was happening between Jason and me. But the more Jason talked, laying out his plan, the more I felt myself freezing up. I could hear my own thoughts spiraling, telling me I should just go along with it, that it wasn't worth making a fuss over. Jason clearly believed in what we were about to do. He kept smiling at me, encouraging me, like he couldn't see the hesitation written all over my face, and every time I looked at him, I felt that familiar tug, wanting to be supportive, wanting to trust that he knew what he was doing. But underneath that was this nagging doubt, this little voice whispering that maybe I wasn't okay with it, maybe I was ignoring my own instincts just to keep the peace. It's strange how loyalty can feel like such a double-edged sword sometimes. On one hand, I wanted to be there for Jason, to show him that I trusted him like I always had. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the sense that by blindly going along with it, I was betraying something in myself. My own comfort, my own gut feeling that something felt off. And that back and forth was exhausting, like I was being stretched thin between two different versions of myself. The more I thought about it, the heavier it felt. I'd always prided myself on being steady, reliable, the person people could count on. It's part of why my relationship with Midnight has been so strong. He trusts me because I've always made sure to show up for him, to be consistent, to be someone he can rely on. And now, standing there in this moment, it felt like that part of me was at odds with the part that didn't want to rock the boat with Jason. Every time I tried to brush the feeling aside, it just came back stronger. Jason kept moving around, adjusting things, caught up in his vision, and I found myself wishing I could feel that same clarity, wishing I could just flip the switch and share in his excitement without overthinking it. But instead, all I could feel was this tug of war happening inside me. I wanted to be the supportive partner, the person who says yes without hesitation. But I also couldn't ignore the tightness in my chest, the weight pressing down on me, telling me to stop and think. And that's when I realized what was really bothering me. It wasn't just about the video or the setup or even Midnight. It was about feeling like I had to choose between being loyal to Jason and being honest with myself. Like I couldn't do both at the same time without letting someone down. And maybe that's why I felt so frozen, so unsure of what to do next. I stood there, watching Jason adjust the camera one more time, glancing at Midnight, who was still quietly waiting, and felt the tension sitting heavy between us all. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there. This undercurrent of something unsaid, something unresolved. And I knew that no matter how much I wanted to push it aside, I couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. At that moment, I felt caught in the middle, balancing on this thin line between wanting to be the partner Jason counted on and wanting to honor the part of me that was screaming for caution. And I didn't know how to bridge that gap without disappointing someone. Maybe him, maybe myself. I've always believed animals have a special way of understanding things long before we even say them out loud. It's like they're tuned into a frequency we don't fully grasp. A quiet, instinctive reading of emotions and energy. And with Midnight, it's always been like that. He knows me better than most people do. We've spent years together, side by side, every day building this quiet trust. So when something feels off with me, I don't even have to say a word. He knows. That day, standing in the barn with Jason buzzing around setting up his big project, I was trying my best to stay calm, to mask the unease growing inside me. But the more I tried to hide it, the more I noticed how Midnight was acting differently too. It was subtle at first. Tiny shifts in his body language, little things anyone else probably wouldn't catch. His ears flicked back more than usual, swiveling at every sound. His eyes kept darting between me and Jason, not relaxed like they normally would be. He'd take a step forward, then pause, shifting his weight back like he wasn't quite sure where to stand. I knew him too well to chalk it up to coincidence. Midnight is steady, dependable, not easily rattled. But that afternoon I could feel it. He was feeding off me. It's like he could sense the tension buzzing beneath the surface, even though I was doing my best to keep things light. Smiling when Jason looked over, nodding along like everything was fine. But Midnight wasn't buying it. I reached out to stroke his neck, hoping to calm both of us down. My fingers brushed through his dark mane, the familiar rhythm usually grounding me. But instead of relaxing into my touch, he flinched ever so slightly, his muscles tense under my hand. It felt like he was asking me, without words, what was going on. Why was the energy different today? Why did I feel so unsettled? That's when it really hit me, how closely he was mirroring my own doubt. It's funny how we think we can compartmentalize, keep our emotions neatly hidden away. But animals don't see through those walls. Midnight didn't care what I was saying out loud. He was reading the truth underneath, the hesitation, the worry, the quiet second-guessing I couldn't shake. As Jason continued adjusting the camera, checking the lighting, caught up in his plans, I kept glancing at Midnight. Every time our eyes met, I felt that familiar tug in my chest, like he was reminding me of something I couldn't ignore. He trusted me to be steady, to lead, to keep things predictable and safe. And here I was, standing there unsure, trying to convince myself I could go along with something that didn't feel quite right. The more I watched him, the more it felt like we were stuck in this silent feedback loop. Me anxious, him reacting to that, which in turn made me feel worse. I hated seeing him unsettled. It felt like I was letting him down somehow, breaking the quiet rhythm we'd spent so long building. And it made the knot in my stomach twist even tighter. I tried to take a few deep breaths to steady my nerves. I told myself maybe I was just overthinking. Maybe once we got started it would all fall into place. But every time I tried to convince myself, I'd catch sight of Midnight's shifting eyes, his twitching ears, and it was like he was silently reminding me to pay attention to what I was feeling. At one point, Jason called out to me, asking if I was ready. I forced a smile, nodded, but as I took a step closer to Midnight, I felt his body tense again. He took half a step back, like he wasn't sure about any of this either. And that moment, the way he hesitated, the way he looked at me, hit me harder than anything Jason had said. It wasn't just me feeling unsure. A Midnight felt it too. I realized then how much responsibility I had in that moment. Not just to Jason and his plans, but to Midnight, to the trust we'd built. It wasn't about a video or getting things perfect for the camera. It was about honoring the bond between us, recognizing that if I was uneasy, it wasn't fair to expect him to be anything but the same. The thing is, I know Midnight better than anyone. I know how he moves, how he reacts, the little signs when something's bothering him. And there was no mistaking it. He wasn't his usual calm self. And neither was I. It felt like we were standing on this thin edge together, both of us waiting to see what would happen next. I kept stroking his neck, whispering softly, trying to soothe both of us. But the more I looked at him, the clearer it became that my doubt wasn't something I could hide or push away. He already knew. Animals have this way of reflecting back exactly what you're feeling, and in that moment, it felt like Midnight was holding up a mirror to all the uncertainty swirling inside me. It made me stop and really think about what mattered. It wasn't about whether the camera was ready or whether Jason's idea would make a great video. It was about the relationship I had with this animal standing right in front of me. The trust, the care, the quiet understanding we'd built day by day. And if I ignored what I was feeling, I'd be ignoring what he was showing me too. That realization made the decision feel heavier. I wanted to support Jason, wanted to be the partner who said yes, who shared in his excitement. But I also couldn't ignore the fact that Midnight was showing me, in his own way, that something didn't feel right. And maybe, just maybe, the most important thing in that moment wasn't the project or the plan. It was paying attention to the signals, both from him and from myself. It's strange how sometimes it takes just one moment, one blink of an eye, one shift in the air, for everything you've been feeling to finally click into place. That afternoon in the barn had been building towards something the whole time, though I hadn't realized it until it finally broke open. Jason was still moving around quickly, adjusting things, checking the camera one last time. He had that determined look in his eyes, the one I've seen 100 times before, where he's already halfway into his vision and everything else around him just needs to catch up. Normally, I'd fall in step with him, trusting that energy, going along with the flow. But that day, something inside me felt like it was running in the opposite direction. And as much as I tried to push it down, it only kept rising. Midnight was beside me, shifting restlessly. He wasn't acting out, but every little movement felt amplified. The way he kept lifting one hoof, the way his ears flicked back toward me, the quick glances he kept giving me, waiting. I knew he could feel the tension hanging between all of us, even if no one had said it out loud. Horses don't need words to know when something's off. And standing there, holding his reins, I couldn't shake the sense that he was silently asking me to make a choice, to be clear about what I wanted. Jason called out to me again, asking if I was ready. His voice was upbeat, confident, but it felt far away, like it belonged to a different version of the day, the one where I wasn't standing there questioning everything. I glanced at Midnight, then back at Jason, and my heart felt like it was stuck somewhere in my throat. I wanted to say yes, to smile and go along like I always did. But there was a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't let me, and then it happened. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it hit me all the same. Midnight suddenly pulled back. Not hard, not panicked, but enough to make me stumble slightly. His eyes were wide, his body tense, and for the first time, I felt just how deeply he'd been picking up on all the uncertainty radiating from me. It was like the last little crack in the surface had split open, and there was no hiding it anymore. I stood there frozen for a second, the reins loose in my hand, my heart pounding. Jason started to step toward us, his face flickering between concern and impatience. "It's fine," he said, trying to wave it off. "He's just picking up on your nerves. You've got this. Let's get the shot." But all I could do was stand there, breathing heavy, feeling the weight of everything suddenly crashing down at once. In that exact moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't even fear. It was clarity, pure and sharp, like a light suddenly flicking on in a dark room. I realized that I couldn't keep brushing aside what I was feeling, couldn't keep pretending I was okay when every fiber of me and Midnight was telling me otherwise. I looked at Jason, and for the first time, I really saw him. Not just the excitement or the push to make everything happen, but the tunnel vision that sometimes came with it. And I realized that as much as I loved how big his ideas could be, I couldn't let myself get swallowed up in them if it meant ignoring my own instincts. Midnight was still watching me, his body tense but waiting. And that's when I knew exactly what I needed to do. I took a step back, loosening the reins completely, letting him settle. I reached out to stroke his neck, speaking softly. more for myself than anyone else. "It's okay," I whispered, as much to him as to myself. "We're done." Jason looked at me, confusion written all over his face. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "We've set everything up. You're just nervous. It'll pass." But I shook my head, feeling more sure in that moment than I had all day. "No," I said simply. "This isn't about nerves. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't anymore. I'm not comfortable. Midnight's not comfortable. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to push through." The silence that followed felt thick, heavy, like the air itself had stilled. Jason stood there, looking at me, probably trying to figure out how things had shifted so suddenly. But for me, it wasn't sudden at all. It had been building, piece by piece, and now the pieces finally made sense. I could feel the tension slowly easing out of Midnight, like he knew I'd made a decision. His muscles relaxed under my hand, his ears flicking forward again. It felt like he was letting out a breath I hadn't realized we'd both been holding. Jason didn't say much after that. He nodded, quietly, and started packing up the equipment. There was no argument, no frustration, just a quiet understanding settling between us, like maybe he realized something too. As I led Midnight back to his stable, I felt something inside me loosen. It wasn't just about that afternoon, or the video, or even Jason's big idea. It was about learning how to listen to myself, how to trust that when something feels wrong, I'm allowed to say so. And more than that, it was about recognizing that the bond I have with Midnight isn't something I can push aside just to keep the peace. That connection deserves to be protected, and sometimes that means standing firm even when it's hard. By the time Midnight was settled, brushing calmly in his stall, I felt lighter, clearer than I had in days. I walked back outside, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the ranch. Jason was sitting quietly, the camera packed away, and when he looked at me, there was something softer in his eyes. "We'll figure something else out," he said simply, and I nodded, knowing that the real thing we figured out that day wasn't about a video at all. After that afternoon, everything felt different. It wasn't dramatic or loud. There weren't big arguments or slammed doors. But it was like something inside me had shifted, and I couldn't unsee it. For the first time in a long time, I realized how much I'd been quietly going along with things, not wanting to cause waves, not wanting to disappoint anyone, especially Jason. He's always been the dreamer, the one with big plans, the one who sees possibility everywhere. And I've always admired that about him. But somehow, without even noticing, I'd fallen into this habit of saying yes to things, even when that little voice inside me whispered no. I think part of me felt like keeping the peace was more important than honoring how I really felt. But after standing in that barn with Midnight, after seeing how clearly he'd mirrored my unease, it was impossible to ignore anymore. Something had to change. That evening, after everything was packed up and quiet had settled back over the ranch, Jason and I finally sat down together. It wasn't easy. I could feel the tension still lingering, not angry, just heavy. He looked at me, waiting, probably unsure where to start. So I took a deep breath and spoke first. I told him how I'd felt, about how the pressure to go along with his ideas had been building, how I hadn't wanted to say no because I didn't want to let him down, but how standing there with Midnight, seeing how even he could feel my doubt, made me realize I couldn't keep pushing myself past my own limits. Jason was quiet for a while, listening. I could tell he hadn't fully seen it before, the way his enthusiasm sometimes swept me up without leaving space for me to say how I really felt. He's not a bad person. His heart's always in the right place. But sometimes when someone you love is so focused on making something happen, they forget to look around and check if everyone's still with them. And honestly, I hadn't done a great job of speaking up either. I'd been going along with things, thinking that was what being supportive meant. But support doesn't mean losing your voice. I told him all of that. My words slow, careful, but honest. It felt like a weight lifting as I finally put it out there. And to his credit, he didn't get defensive. He just nodded, taking it in. Eventually, he admitted he hadn't realized how much he'd been pushing, how much his excitement might have felt like pressure. He said he trusted me to say no if I needed to, and that hit me hard, because the truth was, I hadn't trusted myself enough to say no until now. That conversation was a turning point for us. It wasn't just about that one afternoon or that one idea. It was about learning how to create space in our relationship where both of us could speak up, set boundaries, and still feel like we were on the same team. It was about realizing that trust isn't just about going along with everything. It's about being able to say, "Stop, I'm not okay with this," and knowing the other person will respect it. Afterward, I spent some quiet time with Midnight, brushing him down, letting the simple routine settle me. I kept thinking about how much trust there is between us, how he relies on me to be steady, to listen to what he's telling me, even when it's not in words. And I realized that's exactly what I needed to do in all parts of my life. Trust isn't one-sided. It's not about one person leading and the other following blindly. It's about meeting each other where you are, paying attention to the unspoken things, and adjusting when you need to. In the days that followed, things felt lighter between Jason and me. We didn't rush to plan the next big thing. Instead, we focused on reconnecting, talking more openly, making sure we were really listening to each other. It was small changes, checking in before diving into something new, asking how the other person felt, leaving room for both of us to be honest. And I realized how much stronger that made our relationship feel. Not because we were saying yes to everything, but because we were both showing up fully, without the weight of unspoken expectations. And with Midnight, that trust felt even more solid. Every time I walked into the stable, I felt that quiet reassurance in the way he greeted me, ears forward, calm, steady. It was like he knew I'd finally listened, not just to him, but to myself. That's the thing about boundaries. They're not about shutting people out. They're about making sure you can show up in a way that's healthy, that honors both you and the people or animals you care about. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that moment of clarity. It wasn't easy, and it forced me to take a hard look at how I'd been handling things. But it also gave me a chance to step into my own voice, to recognize that trust and loyalty don't mean losing yourself. They mean having enough respect for yourself and the people around you to be honest, to speak up, and to stand firm when something doesn't feel right. Jason and I are still figuring it out. Relationships aren't perfect, and there will always be moments when one of us gets caught up, when we need to pause and recalibrate. But now there's a different kind of understanding between us, one built on mutual respect, on the knowledge that real trust includes room for boundaries. And as for Midnight, well, he's still the same steady presence, always there, always honest. Every time I walk into the barn now, I'm reminded how much we can learn just by paying attention, by slowing down long enough to hear what's really being said, even when it's unspoken.